So thanks to popular demand from your side, I've been using the Mi A2 as my main phone since the past couple of weeks now, actually more than that. But honestly, this was one of those devices that I was least interested in covering on the channel just because of how similar it is to the Mi A1 that I covered just last year around the same time pretty extensively. And if you remember that video, I began by saying that Google partnering with Xiaomi for the Android One program, especially in India, makes more sense to reach out to more people. With the Mi A2 being so familiar to the Mi A1, it seems like the sole purpose, the sole motive of making the Mi A2 itself was just to keep the Android One program in your sight. Basically, just trying to prevent it from getting out of your sight and out of your mind. Let me explain. So the design is great. It's a bit like the Redmi Note 5 Pro, a bit like the Mi A1, and a tiny bit like the iPhone 10, obviously. I like that it's just one singular piece of metal, so no partitions or breaks. Plus in black it also looks really classy. The buttons are also decently tactile, so not a problem there. But it has some issues, some that might meet your eye and then some that might not. Firstly, the camera bump. Now almost every smartphone has one. I mean, even the most expensive ones like the iPhone XS Max has it. But this is just on a completely different level. It's the most protruding camera housing ever. It's so intense that the case that comes within the box for this phone itself has a raise to house this module. It's just an unnecessary bump considering the fact that it's such a big phone, which brings me to the front of the phone. So it's a new aspect ratio, for this series, 18:9, and it spreads across 6 inches, and the display quality is much improved in my opinion. I remember the one in the Mi A1 was clearly not as vivid and colorful as this one is. That one also did not nearly get as bright or dim as this one does, which is pretty spectacular. But one of the things that I pointed out with the Mi A1 last year, if you remember, were the huge bezels. This time they have clearly reduced in size, but according to today's time, that is still a pretty sizable chin and forehead, and their benefit to the consumer is nothing. So that is basically a clear waste of space. Speaking of which, there's also no headphone jack. Now, I don't know why would Xiaomi do that, especially in this price segment when there are so many other smartphones that have a headphone jack at a lower price tag. I don't know. Even with the Type-C port, it does not have any faster data transfer speeds. Plus a couple of times, and only a couple of times, I've had this to overheat with the stock charger that ships within the box while charging, which is a bit weird because it never got hot while using cellular data or playing games for hours. It's a bit weird. Speaking of weird, let's talk about the software, probably the reason why you would want to get this device. So it's snappy, it's smooth, it's stock, maybe it will be quick in updates, but it lacks a lot of features. So, like, you cannot swipe on the middle of the screen or the fingerprint sensor to bring down the notification panel like you could last year. That's gone for some reason. But just like the last year, it still takes almost a second for the unlocking animation when you tap the fingerprint sensor. It just has not been fixed. Also, at least to me, the settings app really feels incomplete. There are just not a lot of options. For example, if you search for gesture, there is just one, and that is to jump to camera by double pressing the power button. I've got to say it's quick in its defense, but it's the only one and I want more. Secondly, there is no option to choose a theme, like say a dark one. So the closest that you can get to a dark mode is by setting a not so bright wallpaper. That's how you do. Thirdly, you can't set any shortcuts like double tap to wake up or press the home button twice for it to sleep, which is just very inconvenient. So considering the fact that this is such a software oriented phone, it's just very disappointing to see such a lack of options. But let's talk about the internals. I don't really talk about this a lot in my smartphone videos, probably because I am not really concerned about those most of the times, because mostly they're really good, and the Mi A2 is not an exception. It's a great phone performance wise, really snappy, really smooth, but don't get this for gaming. This will drop frames when you will play PUBG on this. I did get knocked out one time because of the frame drops, although nothing major. But there's one thing that I would like to address from the internals, and that is the battery. It's 3000 mAh. The Redmi Note 5 Pro, being similar in size, has a 4000 mAh battery, and the difference shows. The average screen on time with the Mi A2 is not more than 4.5 hours. And if you game, you can kill this in about half a day. Clearly a waste of space. But above all of this, there is one thing that is going for the Mi A2, and that is of course the camera, and you probably already have heard about this. So the first sensor is a 12 megapixel sensor with a lens of f1.8, and the other has a 20 megapixel sensor with the lens of the same aperture, and when combined with a flash, the entire housing to me looks like a traffic signal. But it's just an iPhone X ripoff. But the images might just be the best ones in this segment. The portrait mode, I remember just like the last year, is still pretty good in terms of edge detection both in the front and the rear cameras, and the images overall turn out to be fairly balanced in terms of exposure and dynamic range, much better than I remember from the Mi A1. But when you combine all of this in a package, I would not really want to recommend this phone. Basically, let me tell you the story of the Mi A2. It looks good, it has a clean no BS software, and it has a great camera which really helps it to score higher. But then you look at the things like the lack of the headphone jack, lack of pre-built software, average battery life, still pretty sizable chin and forehead, and average gaming performance. All these things really push it down, and that's the Mi A2. Maybe it's great for outside India markets where there is not much competition and not much choices for the consumers to choose from. But in India, that's not the case. In India, you can get a much better deal at a better price tag, at a lower price tag from Xiaomi itself in the name of Redmi Note 5 Pro. Or you can just go with the Poco F1. Don't get the Mi A2, skip this one. Get a Poco F1 or the Redmi Note 5 Pro, or maybe wait for the Redmi Note 6 Pro. That should be out soon too. That's been it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope this was useful. I hope it's not as controversial. And I'll talk to you in my next one. Take care.